be reviewing the process and procedures for these OST Startup Awards for the organizations that are either new organizations or existing organizations with new sites for the school year 2023-2024. So again, thanks everybody for joining us. I just want to go through a couple ways to engage. First of all, this is a webinar. There will be a Q&A later. We're generally wanting to record questions in the question portion of Zoom. You'll see that as one of the options on your screen to do the Q&A. That's going to allow us to track those questions and share back out to organizations or individuals who perhaps weren't able to participate today. And then if again, people are muted. If you submit a question and we need more clarity towards the end, we'll ask you to unmute and allow you to verbalize your question. This session will also be recorded so that those, either you, if you want to revisit it, or if a staff member who wasn't able to attend, would like to view the webinar, it will be recorded, and we will share out the slides as well. So I just want to touch on the purpose of this session, especially because we have a lot of new organizations who are joining our OST network. This session is going to really focus very specifically on the guidance for the Startup Awards. We're going to very briefly touch on a couple components of the overall contracting process for the school year, but there will be a separate session for all of our network on the SY24 contracts. So I just want to make sure people understand that will be occurring. Okay, we have a packed agenda. Though I will say I'm going to go through a lot of this information fairly quickly. It's an overview of what was also distributed in the procedural documents. And then we're really going to spend the bulk of the time with questions and answers. I think that I know I've received some questions via email. I know individuals have questions. If the information we're providing in this webinar doesn't answer your questions or isn't clear enough for you, we really encourage that you stay on for the second half, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. We've set aside an hour and a half for this. I do not think the presentation will not take an hour and a half. So really the bulk of this time will be for Q&A. So there hasn't been a lot of. All right, just a brief introduction of the OST contracting team. That's the team that works on the contracts and compliance for the OST network. That's myself, Abigail McMahon. I'm the director of the OST intermediary. We have Rob Larimore, who's the senior manager for systems and quality, who is also one of the panelists listed on this call, and then Greg Davis, who is the OST technical assistance manager. Greg will be will be supporting those providers who need assistance with PA/DHS certification. We are not. We'll dig into that later, but just. Our role is to provide assistance. We are not engaged directly in the PA/DHS certification. We are not, consultants or coaches on that process, but we can support with the overall understanding of the regulations and the process. And then we have two contract specialists, Dolores Fuqua and Leslie Robinson Brown. We are in the process of hiring a third contract specialist as well. Also on this call, as I know a large number of our program team is on this call as well, and I think we'll have a chance to do those introductions more formally when we come together to do an overview of the entirety of the SY24 contracting process, and also we'll be doing a kickoff event in early September, and anticipate in late August we'll be doing a review of the standard operating procedures for the program, and we'll also have a chance to introduce the program team then as well. So thanks everybody for being on the call. And of course, some of you who are renewing providers are already familiar with the programs team, having worked with them for the last several years. Okay, an overview of the Startup Awards. The goal of the Startup Awards is to minimize gaps in services and ensure that our school year OST programs are fully enrolled and adequately staffed by September 2023. the startup awards are intended for new sites, and that's because for our organizations that are renewing, that are operating at sites that they previously operated with and are operating over the summer, the current funding structure for the summer supports a lot of the activities that roll into the school year, right? So staffing are often in place. There's already efforts at enrollment and recruitment for families. They have the summer funding for our renewing providers covers some of the costs for staff to engage in the school district's prerequisites. So that activity is covered for those providers that renew and are operating this summer. So we wanted to make sure that the organizations that are joining the OST network for the first time, and also those organizations that may be existing providers but are operating new sites, have funding available to engage in those very important startup activities to ensure that the program can be operational in September. And so, as I mentioned, so that is the alignment with the renewing OST program sites. And then I think everybody knows from the documents that have been shared already, for these startup awards, the available funding is $461.50 per awarded slot. So if you were awarded 46 slots for an elementary school model, that would mean that your award would be augmented by $21,229 for the startup period. And I know some folks may be putting questions into the Q&A. That's great. Please do so. As they occur to you, please put them in. We will take a pause at some point to check through and see what we can answer. And then again, most of what we'll do is answer a lot at the end. So hopefully some of this will answer the questions you have. So who is eligible for these startup awards? So providers who are eligible are those that are operating a OST program at a new site that was not funded in the 2022-2023 school year. So that would include both new organizations to the network whose site they have not operated, they did not operate an OST funded site last year, and then renewing organizations who are operating new sites in the network. Startup awards. I want to just cover a little bit of information, and this is again where we're going to have a little information about the entirety of the FY24 or the school year 24 awards. These startup awards are cost reimbursement based awards. So that is based on the award amount is set. The invoice amount is based on your actual expenses. So providers who are engaged in the startup activities should be keeping track of the expenses that they're incurring to undertake these activities, and they will be reimbursed for them under these startup awards. However, that is capped at the total amount of the startup award, that fixed amount of $461.50, I think it is, that we discussed in the last slide. It is possible that your expenditures will be less than that award amount. That's fine. You would only then receive the amount that you have expenses for. If your expenses exceed that amount, it's capped so that you would not receive additional funding. And then, of course, all the expenditures have to align with the procedural document. During the school year, we switched to a fee-for-service model. And in that model, the invoice amount is calculated based on the number of children that attend the program at least 2 days per month. That's the fee structure for the school year program. Expenses are still reported in the expense report. But those expenses, you'll be developing and submitting an approved budget for the school year, and those expenses must align with that budget. And then for the fee-for-service school year awards, your expenses actually have to equal your revenue. So it's a little different of a model. I just want to make sure that's clear to folks, because those of you that are engaged in the startup activity are going to transition from one to the other during mostly from August to September. For most of you, a few might need some more time. So the startup period is July 1 to August 31. Yes, it's already started. We are working as fast as we can to get information out to everyone. That does mean that the contract term will be set to July 1. So if you have been incurring expenses, they may be eligible for you to receive reimbursement for if you have been incurring expenses in this month. There is, I'm sure some of you, many of you, especially those who are operating new sites that have to get PADHS certified, will have questions or concerns about what happens if you're not ready by September 1. There is the opportunity to receive an extension. We would need to know that a good faith effort has been made by the provider to meet all of the required timelines. And then again, if granted an extension, it does not increase the amount of the startup award. That is fixed. So just be mindful of that as you are working your way through this process. So I think I might stop and just see what the questions are in the Q&A. I see there are 2. Maybe these are something I think
the current questions from Kate are connected a little bit more to timeline.
Okay.
And we might get there in a little bit. I don't see anything else right now.
Okay, so we'll loop back to those. If Kate, if those aren't answered over the next couple of slides, we'll get back to those. Thanks, Rob. So what are the allowable activities for the startup? They include staffing, securing PADHS certification only for those general strategy elementary and/or middle school models. Those are the only ones that the city requires to get PADHS certified, and really the only ones that are appropriately covered by PADHS certification process. Outreach, recruitment, and pre-enrollment activities are allowable startup activities. Purchasing curriculum and getting staff trained on that curriculum is an allowable startup activity. And then for the School District of Philadelphia sites, completion of various school district prerequisites and the potential costs that might be incurred, primarily staff costs, that would be incurred to complete those activities, which is prerequisites for facilities. There's an insurance requirement, food services, and the big one is getting all of your staff's clearances approved through the school district if you're operating in a school district site. So we understand that those take staff time costs money. And so we want to make sure that your organization has some funding for those costs. Okay, allowable expenses. So allowable expenses fall under 4 categories: staffing, consultants and contractors, operating, and indirect. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each of those. There is also additional detail in the procedural document that we sent out. And a lot of this is pulled from that, but I'm going to try to go in a little more in depth. And again, we'll answer questions as at the end. So for allowable expenses for staffing, so salaries and related benefits for positions that align with the required OST positions in the RFP. This primarily means that we would encourage you to go ahead and get started on hiring that site director. That's a crucial position. It's going to, first of all, it's crucial for PADHS certification, and it's crucial for your relationship with school principals. It's crucial for developing relationships with families that are going to enroll the kids. So it's a crucial position, and we want to make sure that you know that if you hire that person in August, you can ensure that you can cover their salary. Or if you hire them in July, which would be even better. So in addition, we're also allowing you to include salaries and benefits for program administration staff that are engaging in those allowable activities. So in the process of hiring a site director, you might have a program manager or an administrative staff member working on the PADHS certification, or you might have them engaged in like a walkthrough at the school or working with the principal to develop the plan. They may be gathering documentation for the school district's approval process. All of those times when those staff are engaging in allowable activities, those costs can be attributed to this startup award, with the exception of some things that we consider indirect, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. So again, for staff, just be mindful that they have to be engaging in an allowable activity, and they have to, and it's only the portion of their time that is during this startup period that is eligible for reimbursement. And we are anticipating that we would see benefits prorated based on the amount of time that the staff is included in the activity, that we're covering that appropriate portion of their benefits costs. Consultant contractors. So consultant contractors, just a note about like who is a contracted staff. Sometimes this comes up. Contracted staff versus part-time staff, because we know OST providers do hire a lot of hourly staff. If you're covering payroll costs or payroll taxes for that person, then that is not a consultant or contractor. This would be somebody you would have a separate contract with, or and you would be maybe perhaps paying them an hourly rate, but you are not covering any of the payroll taxes or other costs. You are simply paying them their hourly rate for a consultant or a contractor, and those costs are their responsibility under those kinds of agreements. So costs for consultant contractors, again, they have to be engaged directly in allowable activities. And for the startup period, one example we might see is you might hire someone to assist with the PADHS certification process. That's something we've seen in the past. There might also be, you might bring in a trainer to train all your staff on your curriculum, for example. Those would be the types of contractor consultant costs that we might expect to see. A couple things, again, there are certain things that are included and considered indirect. So if you contract out for your finance, like your controller, like if you use your part-time controller or another fiscal entity that manages your books, or if you hire or use a human resources organization as a contracted or consulting organization, those are considered indirect costs and would not be included in as a direct activity. So allowable expenses for operating. There's a lot of detail in the procedural document. I encourage you to review that. I think what we want to make sure is that when you are including items in your expenses for this startup period, that you are very detailed in your descriptions as to what that activity was, what that cost was in operating, how it was linked to an allowable activity, and how you came up with that cost. And we have an example we're going to show you towards the end of the session. Okay, and then indirect. I want to spend a little time here. I want to make sure everybody understands the indirect charge. So under our contract with the city, under the city's general provisions, organizations are capped at 10% of total expenditures for indirect costs. It can be less, it cannot be more. So providers should calculate their indirect cost rate. Some organizations might have a certified indirect cost rate based on their contracts with the federal sources, but all organizations should be doing that, should be developing their indirect cost rate, determining what is in the indirect cost and what is not, and what is going to be direct cost, and then how that is and that rate compared to your program costs. So what I want to highlight is really this last item, which is what we consider as things that are generally counted towards indirect. So that would be general administration, sort of just the overall functioning of the organization to administer the program. The personnel functions, so, we typically consider HR to be an indirect cost. There are a few exceptions I will touch on. We consider, if you have to staff an event, or you're having, if you're having someone travel to and there's not much travel that is indirect in this startup period, so I think I won't go into that too much deeply. But if you have an internal database that you use for your own activities to track enrollment and attendance or whatever you might be doing, and you have to get the staff trained on that, that would be sort of an indirect cost. Budget preparation, that's not covered by this startup award, though you will be asked to prepare a budget for the school year. It's not a cost that we would cover. Purchasing, payroll, human resources, bookkeeping, financial monitoring, correspondence and report preparation, and then, managing your equipment and your space. All of those, are not considered direct costs. Those are indirect. Let's pause. Are there questions that cover those activities, Rob? You know, you're monitoring that.
Yeah, there's a question from Elizabeth. Is the PADHS certification required for middle school providers?
Yes, it is. If you are, PADHS certification goes up to, I guess I have to think about that. You can, PADHS certification goes up to children who are entering into, I think, up to the age of 13, so entering into high school. So yes, our anticipation is that elementary and middle school providers are getting PADHS certified. Middle school only providers, it's a school age, it's called a school age only certification, and that is included in the requirements.
And there's one other question from Elizabeth, but it's about allowable expenses and the timeline. So I think we'll be able to come back to that in a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Okay, invoicing and documentation. So we do not require you to submit a documentation with your invoice, with your expense-based invoice. We do require you to keep it and have it on hand and be prepared to present it to an auditor, to our contract specialists, either at the time, we may request at the time of invoice if we feel we need more information and we aren't getting it. We also may include it in our administrative review. So I just want to make sure that's really clear, that just because we don't ask for the documentation to be submitted with invoice does not mean that you don't have to have it. You do have to have it. You have to keep it. You have to retain it. When you get your contract, you'll see, I believe it's five years for that the documents have to be retained. So please be mindful of that. We do want to make sure that you are documenting your expenditures appropriately. So, and then of course, this is also proof of those allowable activities. And that is also a component that we want to make sure is important. So some things that we would anticipate being proof that you engage in these allowable activities and therefore have allowable expenses is proof of attendance at a PADH orientation session. So who attended, when did they go, proof of that participation, copies of the PADHS certification application, obviously something you should retain anyway, attendance at CitySpan 101 trainings, that would be, again, something that you would want to document who attended, when they attended. I believe that certificates may be provided by those individuals who do the CitySpan training, but we can check on that and get back to you. Entry of child data and enrollment of children into OST activities in CitySpan, that kind of documents itself. We can see what's in CitySpan, so getting that information in there is great. You should be retaining physical copies of any child applications that you receive as well in their files. Submission and approval of school district required documents such as insurance, their staff data sheets, staff clearances. We are very closely engaged in that process, so we kind of see that documentation as it comes through. But again, encourage you to retain that as well in case it is requested of you. And then for the school district as well, there's a submission of requests to Facilitron and food services and completion of the school district of Philadelphia site-specific collaboration plan. That's a document. So again, retain that document for your files. Invoicing. Providers will receive an invoice cover sheet template and an expense report template, and then instructions for submitting those. We're going to have a example of that expense report template in a few minutes, but we will share that out with you, and that is the documentation you will use for invoicing. You'll fill out both templates and submit them to PHMC based on the instructions that we provide on that process. So these cost-based invoices can be submitted on the following schedule. For expenses incurred July 1 to July 31, you can submit an invoice on or before 8/15, August 15th, 2023. For expenses incurred from August 1st to August 30th, you can submit an expense report and invoice on or before 9/15, September 15th, 2023. Alternatively, due to the compressed time frame and based on providers' needs and administrative burden, you can opt to submit one invoice in September that covers the entire period, July 1 to August 30th. So that is also an option. That sort of depends on your fiscal capacity and also your operational capacity to submit in multiple invoices. If you're granted an extension, we'll identify the additional invoice periods, it's most likely going to be that you would have another invoice period for September that you would submit October 15th. So if you are, again, that is only available to those that have an approved extension. The total amount of the award is capped, so your total amount of invoices cannot exceed that capped award. Providers may incur costs below the total amount of the startup award, as we described. You may not draw it all down. That's okay. For us, it may not be ideal for you, but that's it. You have to have expenses that support those that support whatever you're invoicing for. You cannot exceed the amount of the startup award. You cannot invoice for more. And providers may not apply costs to the startup awards that are incurred on or after the first day of programming at the site. So just be mindful of that. And that's particularly true for any site that does receive an extension. If you get an extension till your program starts in September and it starts on September 15th or September 25th, you can invoice up until the 20th. You can incur expenses under the startup award up to the 24th, for example, if program starts on the 25th. All right, this is an example. I'm sorry, it's not very visually appealing. I did try to make it a little bit better, but what I really wanted to focus on is these startup awards, the kinds of expenses we would expect to see and the kinds of justifications and narrative explanations we need in order to process those invoices. So I want to make sure, I think this might also help elicit some questions or otherwise raise some issues for you all. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to see what we would be looking for and how we would review it. And this is a modified version of the template that I made to fit into the slide. So something, just be mindful of that. So hourly personnel, salary and hourly personnel, that's the personnel costs that we talked about, those staffing costs that are allowable. So in this example, I've identified that there's a manager of youth programs. They're spending time in July and August on all of these activities. It's taking 25% of their time. And so you can see in the narrative, we've identified which activities they're involved in. And then we are identifying the cost calculation that was arrived at to figure out how we came to this $1,041.61. So that's really, these are the sort of the two main points that we want to make sure that are included, that you are considering as you are looking at your costs. If you have questions about whether a cost is allowable, either now or later on, you can certainly ask us. Eventually, you will be assigned a contract specialist who will become your point person for this activity. We're still working on those assignments right now. So again, we have a manager of youth programs. That person is expected to, sorry, I can't click on the slide or it moves. That person is expected to spend, that person that's documented, they're spending 25% of their time in July and August. And so that's how that was calculated. This manager of youth programs was able to get the site director hired. They started on the 24th of July. So that first week was spent, 100% of that time was spent on allowable activity. It was training and supporting DHS certification. The site director's annual salary is $44,000 a year. And so I think this should be 44 divided by 23 weeks. That math may be a little bit off. My apologies on making that error. I was putting this together a little bit quickly. So 44,000 divided by, it should be 52 weeks. I just typed the wrong numbers. My apologies there. I think the math still holds though, because I did that separately, just typed it wrong. Yeah, so it's $44,000 divided by 52 weeks is $846 a week plus 1 day. I calculated that by dividing 846 by 5. And then that is how we got the 1,115. So what we want to be able to do is see again, when we're reading these documents, okay, that person is spending this much time on allowable activities and this much time equates to this dollar amount. That's what we want to be able to understand. You should have some information on how you calculate your fringe benefits, what your fringe benefit rate is. This is just an example. I am not expecting that everybody has a fringe benefit rate of 28%. That is not a requirement. I know sometimes our examples get taken a little literally as like the sample budget. That's not what this is. It is just an example. The payroll taxes calculate in the expense report template, so you don't have to worry about that. And again, just noting that consultants and contractors would not have payroll taxes, so they're in a different category. Moving down in this example, no consultants or contracted personnel were used this month, so there's no charge. And then operating costs, these are some examples of operating costs we would see. So in this example, the organization is charging part of the cell phone costs for the manager of youth programs. The monthly cost for the cell phone is $65. The manager is working 25% of the time, so it's 25% of the cost. This organization purchased a laptop for the site director. That's appropriate. That site director is going to be needing a laptop to engage in the work that is part of these allowable activities. So we would expect that that's an allowable cost. And then this organization is prepaying for an individual to go to training on their curriculum in August. So that is a cost they incurred in July. And so they're reporting it in July because that's when they had to make the payment to the curriculum training entity. And then if you go down a little further, we have total direct costs, and then 10% of the total amount invoiced is the allowable indirect cost. So it's roughly 11% of your direct costs are your indirect costs, but it has to be less than 10% of the total amount in the total costs charged. And this the expense report template will track this total against your award so that you can make sure you don't exceed it. Okay, that is my overview of our contracting and invoicing process and what's allowable and not allowable in the startup awards. I think